Irreversible collapse, accepting reality, avoiding evil. I'm Michael Dowd. I'm recording this at the end of December 2020. This program is divided into 4 parts: the great acceleration, abrupt loss of Gaian stability, progress, overshoot, decline, the life cycle of civilizations, 10 certainties, pro-future versus anti-future hopes, and it's not too late, taking responsibility for our legacy. If you're not already familiar with abrupt climate change and a historical ecological understanding of collapse, this is going to be very emotionally challenging. And I suggest that you actually stop at each of these places, turn it off, take a breath, stretch, whatever, because this is really challenging. It's almost like getting a terminal diagnosis collectively. Over the last 8 years, I've spent between 20 and 50 hours a week studying rise and fall of civilizations, abrupt climate change, and all kinds of things related to ecology and history. And I've encapsulated it in these 3 videos: Collapse 101, The Inevitable Fruit of Progress; Post-Gloom, Deeply Adapting to Reality; and Sustainability 101, Indigenuity is Not Optional. Collapse 101 is really the history of how we got into this mess and why progress always leads to collapse. Post-gloom is really all of the emotional stuff, how to relate to this and stay inspired and on purpose and have meaningful relationships and that sort of thing, and not to wallow in despair. And then Sustainability 101 is really how did we get in this situation in terms of worldviews. And I interpret religion from a pro-future, ecologically grounded way there. So this is really 12,000 hours plus. It could be 15,000 hours, I don't know, but between 20 and 50 hours a week over 8 years, compressed into 3.5 hours. So I thought I was done. And I just moved, my wife and I just moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan. We're 2 blocks away from 7-month-old granddaughter. And I thought I was done. I was retired. And yet I kept finding articulations of our predicament like this: we're at risk of civilizational collapse. It's not too late to win the climate war. We can solve the crisis and get to net zero emissions. The window of opportunity for bold action is closing. Green technology, green growth can reverse global warming. And what I realized is that in those other 3 videos, this is now, I consider this video an introduction to those 3, because what I'm saying in this one isn't in there. And it's actually, I consider it the most important message of my life, is what's in this message, what's in this video. Without an understanding of ecology, energy, and history, specifically without an understanding of ecological overshoot, good people with the best of intentions will unknowingly propose and support policies likely to make a bad situation catastrophically worse. And I realize that's a bold claim I'm making. And yet I would cite these as examples. Open Democracy a few months ago, the faulty science, doomism, and flawed conclusions of deep adaptation. The claim that runaway climate change has made societal collapse inevitable is not only wrong, it undermines the cause of the climate movement. And Michael Mann's book coming out in a few weeks, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet, also attacks Jem Bendell and the deep adaptation folks for saying that societal collapse is inevitable. Well, what I propose here, what I think I'm going to demonstrate convincingly with evidence here, is that that way of framing it is actually going to cause us to behave in ways that are catastrophically worse. So here's the thesis. Here's where I'm going. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable, out of control mode for decades. This great acceleration of Gaian collapse is an easily verifiable fact. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. I'll have many charts here. It'll be obvious. Evidence is also compelling that the vast majority of people will deny this, especially those still benefiting from the existing order and those who fear that accepting reality means giving up, such as those people that were critiquing deep adaptation. The history of scores of previous boom and bust, that is progress, regress societies, clearly reveals how and why industrial civilization is dying. Accepting that Homo colossus's condition is incurable and terminal may be key to not making a bad situation catastrophically worse. And I want to emphasize that. Homo colossus is a term from William Catton. It's industrial, it's humans living, not Homo sapiens, but Homo colossus. And accepting that Homo colossus condition is incurable and terminal may be key to not making a bad situation catastrophically worse. To avoid becoming evil on a geological timescale, we must do three things: minimize the deadliest toxicity, nuclear, methane, chemicals, and so forth; assist plants, especially trees, in migrating poleward; and invest time, energy, and resources in all things regenerative, including thriving with less. That's less with a lisp. It's less energy, stuff, and stimulation, but also less suffering. Most of us find deep meaning in that. So include thriving with less, learning from and supporting indigenous wisdom and experience, and nurturing community eco-literacy and resilience. I'll come back to these at the end and go into them a little more deeply. This distinction is fundamental, the distinction between problems, which can potentially be solved, and predicaments, which can't be. We have to adapt to them. We have to live with them. Death, for example, is not a problem to be solved. It's a predicament. So why would we not prioritize these? Sparing the future our deadliest toxicity, saving thousands of species of trees and plants, and learning and applying regenerative wisdom. Why wouldn't we do these? Well, in my experience, if we lack an ecological and historical understanding of collapse, and if we have a human-centered, that is an anthropocentric view of progress, we're likely to ignore or not prioritize those three things. That's why I'm creating this program. My two great male mentors are William Catton and Thomas Berry. Catton is the author of Overshoot, the most important book I've ever read in my life. Nothing else even close. He says, human society is inextricably part of a global biotic community. And in that community, human dominance has had and is having self-destructive consequences. Thomas Berry, one of the more significant ecological and evolutionary thinkers of the 20th century, author of The Dream of the Earth and The Great Work and others, says something along very similar lines. He says, the most difficult transition to make is from a human-centered to a life-centered norm of progress. If there's to be any true progress, the entire life community must progress. Any so-called progress of the human at the expense of the larger life community must ultimately lead to a diminishment of human life itself. And this, when we remember the nested nature of reality, I go into this in my Sustainability 101 video, I'm just going to mention it here, that reality is nested. We're made up of smaller, creative, intelligent realities like our microbiome, and we are dependent upon larger, creative, intelligent realities like trees and other species and this sort of thing. So everything inside us and outside us that we don't exist without is primary reality. And as all indigenous peoples knew and know, if we don't treat primary reality as primary, we cause our own destruction. I did a 20-minute video a couple of years ago called Sane versus Insane Progress. And I just want to cap the four main points. How we define and measure progress determines our behavior and what kind of a world that we are leaving our grandchildren and other species. Banking on technofix or political solutions will lead to catastrophic nuclear meltdowns and incalculable, needless extinctions. Problems caused by economic growth and development will not be solved by more of the same. Indeed, our predicament will worsen. And understanding ecology, energy, and history undermines expectations that human ingenuity, technology, or the market can save industrial civilization. Turns out that ingenuity, technology, and the market is what got us into this mess in the first place. Most people don't know that. So I want to really emphasize the second one. Banking on technofix or political solutions, quote unquote, will lead to catastrophic nuclear meltdowns and incalculable, needless extinctions. I think I misspelled that there. So here are the common ecocidal patterns of anthropocentric, that is human-centered civilizations. This is the last 5% of human history, the last 8,000 years or so, roughly 400 generations. This is the pattern. We see the well-being of the elites in the ruling class, what gets called wealth and progress, goes up, while the well-being of the bioregion and the habitat, that is carrying capacity, that's an ecological concept, real wealth goes down. And again, we only understand this if we understand human history from the lens, through the lens of ecology, energy, and history. And I'm mentioning a number of resources in this because I'm imagining that this is going to be challenging for a lot of people. So these are resources if you want to see where I'm grounding my case here. A Forest Journey by John Perlin, The Story of Wood and Civilization. Geodestinies, The Inevitable Control of Earth's Resources Over Nations and Individuals by Walter Youngquist. What those books document is over and over and over again, civilization after civilization, wiping out the trees, wiping out the soil, using too much resources, and crash. It's Overshoot. A New Green History of the World by Clive Ponting, The Environment and the Collapse of Great Civilizations, and then the classic, Catton's Overshoot. I've recorded all these. I'll say where you can find the free audios at the end of this program. And there are scores of examples of this pattern in civilization after civilization after civilization. Here we see it now. This is a classic example. Right now, we see the Prophets of Progress saying, hey, it's never been better. The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. Peter Diamandis, Abundance, The Future is Better Than You Think. These are New York Times bestsellers. Factfulness by Hans Rosling, 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think. And then the best known is Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And as with his earlier book, Better Angels of Our Nature, it's documented. He's got all these charts that show how things are getting better and better for at least the elite, for at least a subset of humanity. And he's right. He's absolutely right. And he cites accurately that technological progress and expansion and economic growth and development are what has made that the case. He's absolutely right on that. What he doesn't go on, what these prophets of progress don't see, is that it's precisely those two things, technological progress and expansion and economic growth and development, that has caused the collapse of everything we depend upon. Overpopulation, overdevelopment, overshoot, which leads to climate, soil, forests, waters, species, the loss of soil organisms, nutrients, groundwater, glaciers, rapidly and significantly expanding deserts, deadly droughts, heat waves, hurricanes, flooding, oceanic acidification and dead zones, plastic pollution, nuclear waste, toxic air, water, and soil, and the catastrophic loss of most species, 98, 99% of species. And so what we need to call this is what it is. It's technological devastation and ecocide and economic insanity and destruction. And as indigenous peoples are always reminding, thus those of us in the industrial world, is that any economy that's based on destroying its very foundation is insane. How come these prophets of progress can't see this? Well, I love this quote from Steven Weinberg. With or without religion, good people can behave well and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. Now, of course, he was critiquing the monotheistic faiths, but it applies equally and perhaps more profoundly to the secular, the invisible religion of perpetual progress. Here's the creation myth of the secular religion of perpetual progress. You've got the Stone Age, cavemen, savages, or primitives, hunter-gatherers. Things really start getting good at the agricultural revolution. Notice the positive turn. Farming, cities, civilization. The Enlightenment. Notice the positive term. Reason, science, humanism, progress. The Industrial Revolution. Notice the positive term. Fossil fuels, technology. And then, of course, globalization, space travel, and most techno-optimists have a Star Trek vision of the future, I've found. I sure did for the 12 years that this was my gospel. This is what I was preaching. I now consider this the techno-idolatrous ecocidal myth of man, conqueror of nature. This idea of man, conqueror of nature, I consider now the most ecocidal and idolatrous thought form in human history. And by idol, I'm not meaning bowing down to statues. I mean human-centeredness, anthropocentrism. Good people are dangerous, and great people will engage in great evil when they hold the ecocidal and self-terminating belief that we are destiny's darlings, masters of the universe, conquerors of nature, God's chosen species, or the pinnacle of evolution. Now, I need to say something about good and evil, because I'm using language that's not usually used in science circles. So what is the ecological and evolutionary role of morality? Good and evil language, for example. Well, it's to ensure, historically, it's been to ensure fidelity to reality. That when religion or life ways in indigenous cultures is doing its job, what is good are the things to be encouraged and do more of. What's evil, that language, is we don't do that. And it's related to being faithful to the past, the ancestors, being faithful to the future. Turns out that acting with the seventh generation in mind isn't just a good idea. To do otherwise is evil in traditional language. And also fidelity to the past, to the future, and to the body of life upon which we depend. So fidelity to reality. And every culture has needed to attend to personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. So I'm using good and evil here in the opposite of a relativistic way. I'm meaning it absolutely that good is what promotes or encourages or supports personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. Evil is what diminishes or destroys personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. And of course, this is discerned collectively. It's always the elders of the tribe, or this is not determined by individuals. This is collectively discerned, reflecting collective intelligence. And obviously, there's lots of gray. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray things, and it's just not clear. And I cover this in great depth in my Sustainability 101 video. Sustainable means faithful to the future. Unsustainable means unfaithful to the future. And I suggest that everything else is but a footnote or a distraction. So I'll be using the term collapse, not as collapse of a building or collapse of the Arecibo telescope, as happened a few weeks ago. I'm using it in a biological and civilizational sense. Collapse is when a gradual downward trend in biophysical health and well-being goes into runaway decline, unstoppable, out of control. For example, abrupt climate change. Oh, actually, let me say one thing about this. If you don't understand collapse in this way, you won't know when you're in the presence of these giant redwoods that these giant redwoods, the forests, are in collapse because they're not producing cones except where they're artificially watered. But if you don't have an ecological understanding, you'll miss that. You won't understand that. So, gradual downward trend going into irreversible decline. Collapse is a process, not an event. It virtually always takes decades. Sometimes longer than that, sometimes a century or two. For example, here's industrial civilization over the last 270 years. Okay. And don't take my word on it. Just Google the Great Acceleration. You'll find all these charts that show. Now, of course, they show them going up, which I'll say more about that in a minute. But the Great Acceleration, and usually it's the hockey stick. Since 1950 is when things really take off. Now, of course, they're taking off in ways that are damaging. This is 20 years ago, 2000. So here's what you'll find. If you Google Great Acceleration, you'll find socioeconomic trends, things like world population, GDP, primary energy use, large dams, water use, paper production, international tourism, transportation, and so forth. Everything's going exponential at 1950. And then Earth system trends, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, stratospheric ozone, marine fish capture, shrimp aquaculture, coastal nitrogen, tropical forest loss, biosphere degradation. So these things, they're showing going up, but actually what it means is they're going down in terms of habitability for humans. So these are really ecocidal trends on the left and Earth system collapse trends on the right. So what we're seeing is that the stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable, out of control, runaway mode for 2 to 7 decades. Again, 7 decades ago was 1950. 2 decades ago, just 2000. This is the Great Acceleration. And everything we depend upon, without exception, is spinning out of control. It's already beyond human control, and it's getting worse, faster and faster. Then you add abrupt climate change. Abrupt climate change is not like linear, gradual climate change. Abrupt climate change is like 10,000 years of climate change in just a few decades. And most people who study abrupt climate change say that it's out of our control since somewhere between 1985 and 2000. For example, Nick Humphrey is one of my go-to people. Meteorologist Nick Humphrey has this 27-minute YouTube video, Ongoing Abrupt Climate Change and Consequences. He suggests that it's the mid-'80s is when it's gone into abrupt, out-of-control mode. This is a summary overview of his 16-part blog series, which I've recorded the whole thing. Most of the books that I'll be talking about and things like this that I'll be mentioning throughout this, I've recorded and they're available up for free on SoundCloud. So my narration of all 16 posts you can find there. This I just recorded just a month and a half ago and uploaded to our post-doom website. Abrupt Climate Change, the World Tour, my post-doom conversation with Robert Hunsaker. And Robert takes us around the world, Antarctica, Australia, the Amazon rainforest, the oceans, and Greenland, and the Arctic, and shows how abrupt climate change, what's the evidence? And Connie, my wife, spent 3 days or 4 days adding all kinds of charts and visuals. So this is a great education on abrupt climate change. And he goes region by region, and what's the evidence? What's happening? And how it's, yes, from the mid 80s, but especially from 2000, it's just gone like hockey stick. So all these are other post-doom conversations that I've had. Paul Beckwith and Nick Humphrey are two of the leading people, scientists on abrupt climate change. But Jennifer Hines and Kevin Hester also are, Kevin's worked very closely with Guy McPherson, and who's been sounding the alarm on abrupt climate change for a long time. So again, you can Google measures of the Anthropocene. You'll find these charts, or just Google Great Acceleration. And again, if you don't read the fine print, it looks like everything's getting better, or at least it's an exponential runaway mode since 1950, and then even getting worse, 2000. Of course, now we're at 2020, so these are a little outdated here. There's even a book called The Great Acceleration: How the World is Getting Faster. And as I mentioned before, you've got socioeconomic trends and Earth system trends. But let's look at this. You know, the socioeconomic trends are literally the causes of biosphere collapse. Our only life support system is that side. And so we should call these what they are: ecocidal trends and Earth system collapse trends. So I've switched it upside down just so we can get a better visual here. Gaia's stability, the Earth's biosphere stability, has been declining for 1 or 2 centuries, and an irreversible collapse for 2 to 7 decades. And by every measure, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, mass extinctions, of the previous 5 mass extinctions, only 1 did we lose the insects in the forests, and we're actually accelerating faster than them. Oceans, plankton, coral, fish, acidification, ocean rise. The former head of the Jacques Cousteau Society said that if all humans died tonight, if human beings just were wiped off the planet immediately, the seas would continue to rise 20 to 40 feet over the next 100 to 200 years. It's unstoppable. The soil, the amount, fertility, moisture, permafrost is now in permanently thawing condition. Ice, the Arctic sea ice, Antarctica, Greenland, mountain glaciers. This is actually the most severe. I mean, people don't understand ice. These 2 books are 2 of the best books that have been written in the last 10 years. The End of Ice by Dar Jamel, Bearing Witness and Finding Meaning in the Path of Climate Disruption, and Peter Wadham's A Farewell to Ice. These are profoundly important books. In fact, I consider Dar Jamel's book probably the single most important book on climate change that I've ever read. When most of the Arctic ice is gone, the serious global warming begins. And I'm not going to say more about it here, but learn about phase change and latent heat. So what we're seeing is the great acceleration of Gaian collapse, and that's a fact. That's the truth. And it's in irreversible mode right now. But if we don't recognize that, we're not going to attend to those 3 things that I talked about at the start. You might want to pause here, because this is going to be the most challenging stuff that I share in this video. There are 440 nuclear reactors worldwide, requiring us to assume that industrial civilization has eternal life. Yet we are already 20 to 30 years into abrupt, irreversible, runaway climate change. So here's the 64 million year question, not $64 million, 64 million year question. I invite you to seriously ponder this. As industrial civilization continues to collapse faster and faster, how many Chernobyl or Fukushima-like or worse meltdowns due to wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, tsunamis, power grid failures, political instability, or terrorism do you think are possible, likely, and inevitable? We're going to have nuclear meltdowns, no question. But whether we have 5 or whether we have 105 is going to be dependent upon how seriously we take protecting, capping, casing, getting the spent fuel rods out of the swimming pools and into someplace like Yucca Mountain. If we don't prioritize this, and if we have this vision of perpetual progress, we're not going to prioritize this. That's what I mean by geological scale evil in terms of from the perspective of the body of life. So feel free to pause right now, take a walk, or take a deep breath, and then come back to this. So we looked at the great acceleration, abrupt loss of Gaian stability, progress, overshoot, decline, the life cycle of civilizations. I consider one of the more important questions to be a question that most people don't even know how to make sense of it at the start, which is, what is the shape of the time in which you live? I first heard this from John Michael Greer. 95% of human history, and where indigenous peoples still exist, it was stable. It is stable. It's within nature's normal cycles and rhythms. It's really ahistorical. There's minor daily and seasonal ups and downs, but there's no human-made calendars or clocks, and there's no sense of progress. Even technological change happens very slowly over many, many generations. For roughly 3% of human history, that is the last 400,000 years, we see things are rising, often for 1 to 3 centuries. And this is only in the last 8,000 years or so. Prior to that, it was all stable, or mostly stable. Here's where we see expansion, growth, carrying capacity surplus. Of course, it's stealing from the future, but it's a sense of an age of exuberance is the ecological term. Progress, at least for the elites, obviously not for the slaves and slave civilizations, but progress isn't just a belief, it's an obvious fact. And then roughly 2%, because it usually takes less time to collapse than it does to become great, we're in declining times. And it's known as the Seneca curve. My colleague Ugo Bardi wrote a book with that title. Carrying capacity deficit, not enough energy, not enough resources. Of course, energy is usually timber, wood, until we had fossil fuels. Contraction, and then a post-exuberant age. That is where there's not enough resources. And the contraction, we see a contracting of in-groups and a tightening and all kinds of population pressure, really. Wealth gap widens and unworkability and denial reign supreme. By unworkability, I mean things that worked last week, last month, last year, last decade don't work now and aren't going to work. And that's going to continue to get worse. And denial reign supreme. Most people never get it. People stay in denial in all civilizations that we have evidence of, especially the elites stay in denial, but a lot of people stay in denial. We just can't afford that because if we stay in denial, we're going to let these nuclears melt down and we're not going to assist trees. It turns out that the difference between thousands of species of trees and shrubs surviving the century and those same thousands of species dying, going extinct the century, depends on humans assisting them. So energy rules. Everything depends on energy. All forms of energy are not created equal. Complexity is both enabled and limited by energy per capita. And declining EROEI, that's energy return on energy invested. Declining energy return on energy invested points to a decades-long process of civilizational collapse. We see this over and over again. So I'm not going to say much about this. My colleague Nate Hagens does a fabulous job. But just very quickly, this net energy cliff. This is energy return on energy invested, EROEI. At the beginning, here's the EROEI needed for industrial societies is there. Well, way back here, we had 100 to 1, 80 to 1. That is, for every 1 unit of energy we expended, we got 80 to 100 back. But then over time, it's gotten worse. And coal, solar is here. Nuclear is like 6 to 1, 7 to 1. Tar sands and shale oil, tight oil, we're talking down here. And so this is again, we see this over and over again in previous civilizations. Of course, for them, it was just timber, wood, and soil. But now you can't run an industrial civilization on renewable energies, period. Peak oil is suddenly upon us. This was just a few weeks ago in Bloomberg Green. No, peak oil isn't suddenly upon us. This has been seen for a decade and a half, 2 decades, and talked about a lot. Joseph Brodsky was a very famous Russian literature professor. In fact, I learned about this from, what's his name? I forget. Anyway, Brodsky famously said, he won the Nobel Prize in literature in 1987. He said, "You Americans are so naive. You think evil is going to come into your houses wearing big black boots. It doesn't happen like that. Look at the language. It begins in the language. For example, in my Collapse 101 video, I talk about how we define wealth, success, progress, and development can lead us either in a pro-future way, in a way that's a blessing to the future, or in an anti-future way, in a way that's a curse to the future, just on how we define those terms. And in my Sustainability 101 video, same thing. God, religion, nature, and environment. How we define those words, what we mean when we use those words, can lead us in a pro-future or an anti-future way. I'm not going to go more into that here, but I'll say this, that, Brodsky talked about how evil comes in language. And again, by evil, he simply means that which destroys the future, which is unfaithful to the future. Primitive versus civilized. How do we think of those terms? Well, these quotes are going to call that into question, the way that we've been conditioned to think of these. Forests precede civilizations, and deserts follow them. All of our exalted technological progress, civilization for that matter, is comparable to an axe in the hand of a pathological criminal. The end of the human race will be that it will eventually die of civilization. These are potent quotes. The earth is littered with the ruins of empires and civilizations that once believed they were eternal. Back in February of 2019, the BBC did a future deep civilization series, and Luke Kemp wrote an article called "Are We on the Road to Civilizational Collapse?" And of course, he answered yes. And he's got this amazing chart where he shows 88 ancient civilizations, and he doesn't look back before 3000 BCE, partly because we don't have much writing that goes back there. So there's actually well over 100 civilizations, but we know most about just the last 5,000 years. But he doesn't even look at the last 1,000 years. So from 3000 BCE to 1000 of the Common Era, 88 civilizations. The average lifespan was 336 years. And he takes a look at why civilizations collapse. Turns out that collapse is a feature of civilizations, not a bug. So overshoot is perhaps the fundamental reason, which of course, when you wipe out the trees, then you also have some local climate change. Depletion of resources. Turns out that using complexity and technology to solve problems caused by complexity and technology always achieves a place of diminishing returns. In fact, Joseph Tainter's famous book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, details that. Also, Technofix by Michael and Joyce Hausman, why technology won't save us or the environment. In fact, this is such a substantial book, such an important book. I want to mention 4 major points. That human technology that doesn't integrate with life's technology always does more harm than good. It just does it over time. Technology in the context of ongoing economic growth does not promote sustainability, but hastens collapse. Most technological solutions to social and technology-created problems are counterproductive. And this book shows why new technologies tend to be uncritically accepted, who really controls the direction of change, and why technological cultures predictably self-destruct. Also, a growing gap between the wealth and the rich and the poor. This inequality and oligarchy is characteristic. These are the preconditions for collapse. And then there's also triggers, external triggers, things like war, volcano, famine, disease, and internal triggers, bad decisions, stupidity, bad luck. And the first 3 are moral failure. It's a failure of any institution, religion, or anyone else to hold the society to account, to be faithful to the future. That's in healthy cultures, in sustainable cultures, that's the role of life ways, to ensure faithfulness to the future, accountability to the future, basically to ensure that the future is never compromised by the present. If religion doesn't do that, no other institution in society will do it. That's why this is a moral failure, a religious failure. So sustainable means faithful, but sustainable also means stable. This is the first 95% of human history, 400,000 years, 20,000 generations or so, as opposed to 400 generations. Teddy Goldsmith and Rick Reese. There's so much crazy stuff. If you Google sustainability, if you even go to the Wikipedia page on sustainability, it's almost useless because it starts with civilization, which is the definition practically of unsustainable. So Teddy Goldsmith, Edward Goldsmith, he wrote The Stable Society. I've recorded the whole thing. His magnum opus is The Way, an Ecological Worldview. what Goldsmith did, he was the founder and the editor of The Ecologist magazine for close to 40 years. And he takes a look at the major distinctions between sustainable and unsustainable civilizations over the last 500 years in terms of evidence. So he takes a look at the best anthropological evidence and says, what's the difference? The fundamental differences between sustainable, that is stable, and unsustainable cultures, civilizations. And then Rick Reese, amazing writer. His book, he just finished it, Wild, Free, and Happy. It's up available for free online. I've also recorded the whole thing. But if you really want to understand genuine sustainability, as opposed to faux or delusional sustainability, you got to read Rick Reese or Teddy Goldsmith. I share this. This slide wasn't in my Sustainability 101 video. And I'm sharing this because so many people in colonial settler cultures think that, well, we've just been the ecocidal species. We just can't help ourselves. Well, no. Are Humans Inherently Destructive by Max Wilbert? It's a 2,000-word essay. Also, there's 4 linked articles and an interview at the end. Humans Naturally Destructive by Derek Jensen, which is an excerpt from his book, Endgame. And then Eileen Christ, Confronting Anthropocentrism. This is a video also on SoundCloud. And then there are book length treatments that just devastate this idea that we're an ecocidal species rather than there are ecocidal cultures. Red Alert by Daniel Wildcat, Tending the Wild, M. Cat Anderson, Columbus and Other Cannibals, Jack Forbes, and then Native Science and Original Instructions. Now, I've not recorded these, but these are absolutely essential reading on this topic. But if you only have time, just a little bit, just explore those 2 things there, and you'll see that there's a profound difference between pro-future cultures that are faithful to the future, faithful to time, and faithful to nature, and anti-future civilizations. Here's the pattern of the last 5% of human history. We see this over and over and over again. Unsustainable means progress, regress. There's scores of examples. Usually takes between 275 and 375 years. We see progress, rise, boom, overshoot of carrying capacity, and then regress. So here we see progress, regress, rise and fall, boom and bust, over and over and over again. And as I said before, collapse is a process, not an event. But the inner reality, what's people's emotional response? Well, it turns out that the evidence that we have matches our own experience, which is that if you're born and die in times of progress, in times of carrying capacity surplus, progress isn't a belief, at least human-centered progress. It's just an obvious fact. If you're born and you die in contracting times, well, you just expect things are going to get worse and worse and harder and harder. But the most challenging is when you're born in times of expansion and it shifts in your lifetime. That's where we are now, and that's called suffering, because our expectations were forged in times of carrying capacity surplus, but now we're experiencing carrying capacity deficit. I'll say more about carrying capacity here in a minute. So, ecological overshoot of carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, Tom Wessel's fabulous book, The Myth of Progress Toward a Sustainable Future. Carrying capacity can be defined as the maximum population size that an ecosystem can support without being degraded in some fashion. Once you see a degradation of the living systems, you know that you're an overshoot. And then William Reese, co-founder of the ecological footprint concept, human societies as temporally and spatially far-flung as the Mesopotamians, Mayans, and Easter Islanders came to ruin mostly because they expanded beyond the capacity of their environments to sustain them. If you don't get overshoot, this is a statement from me. If you don't get overshoot, you'll misinterpret or misdiagnose virtually everything important. And Bill Reese, William Reese, and Tom Wessels, these 2 conversations are absolutely a must views, in my opinion. Connie, my wife, and I interviewed William Reese and specifically asked him to give us a tutorial on ecological overshoot. And Tom Wessels is a profoundly gifted writer and teacher. Also, Sid Smith and Carl North. If you don't know these guys, watch these videos. They're solidly grounded. And of course, the granddaddy of ecologist, population ecologist, Paul Ehrlich. So these are all post-doom conversations that I highly recommend, grounded in an ecological worldview. Catton. I mentioned Catton's Overshoot. Derek Jensen calls this the most important book of the 20th century. Paul Ehrlich said something very similar. All four of those, or all five of those guys, also count this as one of the more important books. So I just rarely do you find a book that puts its main argument on the front cover. So carrying capacity, maximum permanently supportable load, cornucopian myth, euphoric belief in limitless resources, drawdown, stealing resources from the future, cargoism, delusion that technology will always save us from, overshoot, growth beyond an area's carrying capacity, leading to crash, die off. And we see this in so many species, not just humans. And Stuart Udall, who was the Interior Secretary under in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, writes the most amazing, it's one of the best critiques of techno-utopian thinking, this forward, that was written in 1980, but I highly recommend, don't skip that forward by Stu Udall. So here's another visual. I consider carrying capacity as the grace limits. There's a grace to how much the living world will provide and how much waste it can absorb before the systems start breaking down. That's what overshoot means. So these are the grace limits. And overshoot means betraying the future and stealing from posterity. And again, in traditional moral language, it's evil. Richard Heinberg, one of the older brothers on this path, also considers Catton's Overshoot one of the more important books he's ever read. He says, our biggest problem is not climate change, it is overshoot, of which global warming is a symptom. See, we focus on climate change, ocean acidification, topsoil desecration and loss, mass extinction, critical resource depletion, chemical and nuclear wastes, growing gulf between the rich and the poor, economic instability and insanity, political dysfunction, the shrinking of in-groups and the rise of totalitarianism and other isms. These things are not the cause of our woes. They are all symptoms of ecological overshoot, of carrying capacity. And the fundamental difference between sustainable and unsustainable, like the trim tab, the most important thing, I think, is how that society defines and measures wealth, well-being, success, and progress. Now, of course, indigenous peoples would say whether you have a personal, humble, responsible relationship to primary reality as primary. But ultimately, so secondary would be how we define and measure wealth, well-being, success, and progress. Do we do so in human-centered terms, or do we do so in life-centered terms? Human-centered measures of well-being and wealth are things like GDP, or it's measuring progress and success or wealth in human-centered terms, in terms of individuals, corporations, and nations. Measuring wealth and well-being in life-centered terms means how well is the forest? How well is the forest doing decade by decade? How is the soil doing decade by decade? What are the other species doing decade by decade? It's measuring progress, wealth, and well-being in life-centered terms. That's what all indigenous cultures did and do. So overshoot of planetary boundaries. Overshoot is the issue. Because even if we could solve the climate issue, which we can't, it's a predicament, it's not a problem. But even if we could, there's 6 or 7 other planetary boundaries that are already collapsing industrial civilization. Again, it's not a matter of will it happen, it's already happening. As I said before, if you don't get overshoot, you'll misinterpret or misdiagnose virtually everything important. And as I said at the start, without an understanding of ecology, energy, and history, good people with the best of intentions will unknowingly propose and support policies likely to make a bad situation worse. That's why I've created this video. So again, I encourage you to pause here, get up, stretch, breathe, and then come back. 10 certainties. There's so many things that we're uncertain of. I suggest these 10 things we can be confident. We can be 100% or at least 99% certain of. Pro-future versus anti-future hopes. The first thing we can be certain of is massive denial, grief, and blame. Denial is the largely unconscious habit of thought whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, our legacy, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of self-worth or superiority. Denial is also the instinctual impulse to reject or discount information that calls into question our hopes, assumptions, or expectations about the future. All of us are prone to denial. This is evolutionarily adaptive. This has served us over time. So none of us are free of this. Grief requires us to know the time we're in. The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the four-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful or hopeless. They are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed. And then Joanna Macy, my most significant female mentor, the depth of your grief is the measure of your love. You wouldn't be feeling grief if you didn't love. So we're going to see massive denial. We've seen that in previous collapsing civilizations. Grief, absolutely. And need I say anything about blame? That's what happens. In contracting times, everybody starts blaming everybody. This is the nature of population pressure. And we do ourselves a disservice if we blame it on all of the other sociological and political defining and categories. BOE, that's blue ocean event. This is certain. Whether it's in the next several years or whether it's the next decade, decade and a half, we don't know. But it could very well be in the next few years, which is where in September, there's no ice in the Arctic, which means all of this energy that was being reflected is now being absorbed into the dark blue ocean, which then releases more methane, which make less ice and that sort of thing. That's why ice is a crucial issue. Permafrost, we're seeing this is already in runaway mode. This is already in collapse mode, out of our control, and releasing of methane. It doesn't even require a methane burp. That is a huge, release of methane. Just all the methane that's being released already from our millions of oil wells, they're being released there, as well as the permafrost and that sort of thing. It's huge. Which means chaotic, deadly jet stream. The jet stream is becoming more loopy, more wavy, which is, we've lost the Holocene. We've lost the stability, the climate stability that allowed for growing grain at scale and allowed for civilization. That's now history. So now the jet stream stays in these patterns sometimes. So you'll have one year really wet, another year really dry, or one year really cold, or another really hot, because we see this jet stream. We're seeing intensely unstable weather. This is certain. The great conflagration of forests. We're in the early stages of where most of the world's forests are going to burn, and it's out of our control now. What happened in Australia last year, in California and Washington and Oregon and the British Columbia, the Amazon. We're seeing the world's forests burning, and this is adding, even if all humans stopped emissions tonight, this is adding tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide, and it's already in out of control mode. Ocean acidification and inundation. As I said before, the oceans are going to rise 20 to 40 feet in the next 100, 200 years, regardless of what we do, which means most of the major cities along the coast are going to be inundated. Mass extinction of plants and animals. These are all certain. We are possibly on the list. Population bottleneck. That's an academic way of saying that billions of humans, as well as other animals, are going to die, and probably not in the too distant future. And I grieve this. I'm living 2 blocks from my granddaughter, and I recognize she's not going to live anywhere near my age. She'll be lucky to live half that. So population bottleneck. Again, this is where the grief is. Mass migrations. What's happening in Syria and Venezuela and other places, much of Mexico is expected to be like a desert, like a Sahara desert in the next 150 years. Where are those people going to go? They're going to go north, they're going to go south, and no wall is going to stop them. And conflicts, and then nuclear meltdowns. We're going to have some, but whether, again, we have just a few or whether we have 100 or 200, 300, or 400 depends upon what we do in the next decade. And did I say anything about massive denial? Notice in yourself, you don't want to hear this. I don't want to hear this. Denial can take climate denial or overshoot denial to, on the right, on the political right here in the United States, climate denial is, climate change isn't real or humans aren't the cause of it or whatever. But there's just as pernicious climate denial on the left, which is that wind and solar are going to save us. This documentary by Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs, Planet of the Humans. Now, there's definitely problems with this movie, no question about it, but it was attacked by people on the left. The progressives and the liberals hated this. And so these, Megan Siebert, Planet of the Humans review, shining a light on the energy black box, William Reese, Crossroads for Planet of the Humans, Planet of the Humans, Why Technology Won't Save Us by Elizabeth Robson, and an interview that Max Wilbert and Jennifer Mernon did. I recommend these because these are scathing attacks on the critiquers. These are people who point out accurately so that those who critique this movie, those who tried to trash this movie, didn't get the fundamental message, which is that we are in ecological overshoot. And no form of technology, no green technology, no green capitalism is going to save us. So I highly recommend these resources. If you're still one that holds out that wind turbines and solar panels are going to save us, or that a Green New Deal is going to save us, please take the time for these resources. And then this book will be out in just a few months, Bright Green Lies by Derek Jensen, Lierre Keith, and Max Wilbert. Techno-optimism. I love this bizarro cartoon just from a few weeks ago. How about if your generation spends less time studying how my generation destroyed the environment and more time figuring out a magical solution? And that's what's not just being proposed, that's what's being counted on. Climate restoration, which is a fancy way of saying geoengineering, NETs, negative emissions technologies, and BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. If you want to really understand these things, just Google carbon-sucking unicorns, and you'll see some of the world's top scientists, like Kevin Anderson, for example, profoundly critiques this. And these are assumed in the IPCC models. This is crazy. This is insane. Techno-utopianism, techno-optimism quickly leads to techno-utopianism and what I call techno-idolatry, which is where we make technology our God. That is our primary concern. It's what we put our faith in. It's what we put our trust in. William Olfels has done more to bring the ecological paradigm to politics and governance than anybody in the English-speaking language. This little 75-page book, A Moderate Greatness, Why Civilizations Fail, is just a gem. I recorded it. And then, as I've also recorded, Apologies to the Grandchildren, Reflections on Our Ecological Predicament, Its Deeper Causes, and Its Political Consequences. Here's how he begins. This is the first paragraph of that book. Civilization is, by its very nature, a long-running Ponzi scheme. It lives by robbing nature and borrowing from the future, exploiting its hinterland until there's nothing left to exploit, after which it implodes. While it still lives, it generates a temporary and fictitious surplus that it uses to enrich and empower the few and to dispossess and dominate the many. Industrial civilization is the apotheosis and quintessence of this fatal course. A fortunate minority gains luxuries and freedoms galore, but only by slaughtering, poisoning, and exhausting creation. I suggest that there are hopes, there are things that we can hope in that are good and things that we can hope in that are bad. Hope is not neutral. It's kind of like water, like saying, do you have hope? It's like saying, do you have liquid? Well, some liquids can kill you, some liquids will sustain you. So anti-future hopes are hoping for or expecting anything that would cause us to not prioritize sparing the future our deadliest toxicity, saving thousands of species of trees and plants, and learning and applying regenerative wisdom. So anything that we hope for that causes us to not prioritize those three things, I suggest is an anti-future hope. Pro-future hopes, well, I love this quote. Today, mankind is locked into stealing ravenously from the future. Human self-restraint, practiced both individually and especially collectively, is our indispensable hope. Now, he wrote this in 1980, which is why he has mankind rather than humankind. But in any case, the point is that human self-restraint is our indispensable hope. And what I mean by less is less, I got this from John Michael Greer, less energy, less stuff, less stimulation. And I've added one more S, which is less suffering. That we can, if we're committed to less energy, less stuff, less stimulation, and less suffering for others, we can be a blessing. Degrowth. A very important movement, the degrowth movement. Decolonization, power down, resilience, and ecological economics. These are all examples of human self-restraint. This is a pro-future hope. putting our hope in these and investing time, energy, and resources in these. So coming back to this way that's so often are talked about, we are at risk of civilizational collapse. It's not too late to win the climate war. We can solve the crisis and get to net zero emissions. The window of opportunity for bold action is closing. Green technology, green growth can reverse global warming. Societal collapse is inevitable or highly likely. This is a great awakening, a great turning, a great transition. I suggest that these ways of languaging it are not only inaccurate, but actually lead us in the wrong direction to not prioritize those three things that I was talking about before. Without a Green New Deal or whatever, we're doomed! Exclamation point. That's usually the way it's spoken about. Well, no, we're doomed, period. No explanation, no exclamation point. We're doomed. Now what? Roy Scranton, New York Times bestselling books. Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of a Civilization. Roy Scranton is one of the most important writers in what I'm calling post-doom. You got to go through doom. You can't get to post-doom without first going to doom. But then on the other side is a whole universe of possibility. And then now is the time to act. The situation is dire. I uploaded a version of this program a couple of weeks ago, and I included this clip from HBO's The Newsroom. Unfortunately, I was blocked, so that's why I had to pull it down. But this is a 4-minute clip. I actually have an 8-minute clip that no longer is up on YouTube. So if you're interested in the 8-minute clip, which is fabulous, just send me an email. My contact information is the end, and I'll send you a link to my Dropbox folder. But definitely check this out, because this has been said to be the most accurate portrayal of the reality of climate change ever on television. And it's fake news. It's a fictional story. And there's this really wonderful famous scene where the newscaster says, so it sounds like, this is the top scientist at the EPA. So it sounds like you're saying that our situation is dire. And he says, no, not exactly. Your house is burning to the ground. The situation is dire. Your house has already burnt to the ground. The situation is over. Again, feel free to pause. Take a breath, take a walk, and then come back to this. The Great Acceleration, we've seen progress, overshoot, decline, 10 certainties. I want to conclude with just a short section. It's not too late, taking responsibility for our legacy. So first thing is, it is too late for some things. It's too late to turn it around. It's too late to save Homo colossus. Homo colossus is where each of us uses like 40 to 60 times the resources and exudes 40 to 60 times the waste of Homo sapiens. It's too late to win the blame game. I mean, you could still play the blame game, but it's kind of like masturbation. It feels good, but ultimately you're just screwing yourself. It's too late to transform the system. It's too late to reverse climate change. It's too late to avoid reaping what we've sown. It's too late to slow or stop the 6th great mass extinction. It's too late to avoid a population bottleneck, that is die-off, due to overshoot. It's too late to prevent a blue ocean event and massive release of methane, the conflagration of forests, ocean acidification, and so on. And it's too late to spare us from the consequences of millennia, not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years of anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, rather than life-centeredness. It's not too late for virtually everything that gives life meaning. It's not too late to attend to and invest in and do whatever you can to further in yourself and others personal wholeness, social coherence, and ecological integrity. Everything you do for that, it's not too late for that. It's not too late to limit the deadliest of our toxicity. It's not too late to assist trees in migrating. My wife is actually one of the main point people in North America on this topic of assisted migration. There was a major book that just came out in June of 2020 by Zach St. George titled The Journeys of Trees, a story about forests, people, and the future. It's published by W.W. Norton, top publisher, and it features Connie, my wife, from the very first sentence throughout the book. It's not too late to be regenerative. That is not just engage in regenerative projects, but to be regenerative in your neighborhood, your community, in your family, in your town or village or wherever. Project Drawdown Paul Hawken. This is an amazing book. So much helpful stuff. Unfortunately, and this wasn't Paul, I know that because I know him. Somebody in the marketing department came up with the subtitle, "The Most Comprehensive Plan Ever Proposed to Reverse Global Warming." And I can't tell you how many people that I know have ignored this book because of the subtitle, because they know it's impossible to reverse global warming. I mean, theoretically, it's possible, but it's theoretically is not mean practically. Anyway, there's lots of great stuff in this book. I highly recommend it. It's all mostly about regenerative. It's really great stuff. I do love this quote from Paul. He says, "There's a rabbinical teaching that says if you're told the world is ending and the Messiah has arrived, first plant a tree, then see if the story is true." Building topsoil and planting trees while nurturing community is perhaps the most holy work that we can be engaged in. And permaculture, agroecology, indigenuity, regenerative everything. It's about partnering with nature, protecting the soil, promoting diversity. It's holistic. And I've had some amazing post-doom conversations with literally some of the top people in the world in this field of regeneration and permaculture. And I highly recommend these four. It's also not too late to invest in using less energy, less stuff, less stimulation, and being committed to less suffering, to lessening suffering, and then to be resilient communities. It's definitely not too late for any of that. And again, I go into this in much greater depth in my Sustainability 101 program. It's not too late to salvage something rather than nothing, as my friend and colleague Michael Milkey likes to say. And it's not too late to live life fully and love the life you live, even at Teotihuacan, that is the end of the world as we know it. And it's certainly not too late to engage in what I call the 5 L's of sane, sober, and meaningful living. Love something, learn something, let go of something, laugh at something, and pass something forward. I say more about these in my Sustainability 101 program, actually also the post-gloom. So a lot more in post-gloom. I realize this program is very difficult to take in. You may not be able to, but in any case, that video, the post-gloom, is where all the practical stuff in terms of how to not wallow in despair, but not to ignore the grief, which is actually healthy. So I highly recommend the post. In fact, the only other thing I'd recommend majorly is the post-gloom video. Summary. The stability of the biosphere has been in decline for centuries and in unstoppable out-of-control mode for decades. This great acceleration of Gaian collapse is an easily verifiable fact. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Evidence is also compelling that the vast majority of people will deny this, especially those still benefiting from the existing order and those who fear that accepting reality means giving up, like those people who are critiquing Jim Bendell. The history of scores of previous boom and bust, that is progress regress societies, clearly reveals how and why industrial civilization is dying. Accepting that Homo colossus's condition is incurable and terminal may be key to not making a bad situation catastrophically worse. I suggest to avoid becoming evil on a geological timescale, we must minimize the deadliest of our toxicity, nuclear, methane, chemicals, and so forth. Assisting plants, especially trees, in migrating poleward, and investing time, energy, and resources in all things regenerative, including thriving with less energy, less stuff, less stimulation, and being committed to less suffering, learning from and supporting indigenous wisdom and experience. I mean, the indigenous peoples and people in the global south have been in collapse. They know a lot about that. And nurturing community eco-literacy and resilience. So let us together religiously prioritize sparing the future our deadliest toxicity, moving thousands of species of trees and plants, and practicing self-restraint individually and collectively, and learning and applying regenerative wisdom. And if somebody is a techno-optimist and believes in eternal progress, whatever, and they prioritize these 3 things, I'm just a deep bow of respect. This is what's most important, in my opinion. I think this is our Turuk Maktau moment, to speak mythically. This is a mythic figure in the movie Avatar, But if you prefer a more traditional mythic interpretation, it's the second coming of Christ moment, where we all get to, or those of us who choose to, get to self-sacrifice for the sake of the future. And I go into how that can be done in terms of the Christian, my own Christian tradition and other religions in Sustainability 101. We need courage, not hope, to face climate change. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. When a civilization is in decline, optimism is cowardice. Kate Marvel is a climate scientist. Oswald Spengler, one of the great historians who set side by side cultures and showed the common patterns. When a civilization is decline, optimism, he said, is cowardice. And along similar lines, optimism and self-pity are the positive and negative poles of modern cowardice. Do not lose heart. We were made for these times. Action on behalf of life transforms. Because the relationship between self and the world is reciprocal, it's not a question of first getting enlightened or saved and then acting. As we work to heal the earth heals us. These are the postdoom.com/resources are, I've recorded 22 foundational books and 80 articles or so. They're all freely available, but if somebody wants the convenience of a flash drive, they can get the flash drive there. And then also the Collapse Wiki, best movies and documentaries, Nate Hagen's amazing and brilliant videos, and then a whole bunch of educational programs and live presentations. So all of that there is postdoom.com. And here's my contact information. Thank you for watching. Feel free to reach out to me.